And let's go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon or morning to some of you, and welcome to this state and federal briefing on housing issues. My name here is John Jukery, and I am a federal affairs advisor with the National Conference of State Legislatures, or also commonly known as NCSL. We are actually headquartered out of Denver, Colorado, but we also have an office here in Washington, D.C. at our nation's capital, where I'm located. And we specialize in facilitating state and federal government relations. And just a few housekeeping notes before we hear from our speakers today quickly. We will plan to record today's briefing, as you may have just heard me do. And I'd encourage and recommend that if you would like to ask a question during the presentations, that you simply just type them into the chat box or send them directly to myself, and we can have those ready to go after we hear from our speakers today. And in the case that you're not entirely familiar with NCSL or in need of a little refresher, that's no problem. But you should know that we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and staff of the states, commonwealths, and territories. NCSL was founded in 1975, and we provide research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers to exchange ideas on the most pressing issues that states are facing today. We are also a highly effective and respected advocate organization and lobby for the interest of state governments within the American federal system. When it comes to the federal government, we are especially supportive of state sovereignty and increased flexibility. Additionally, we are highly supportive of safeguarding states from any unfunded federal mandates, unwarranted federal preemption of state laws, and the conference seeks to promote cooperation between state legislatures in the U.S. and in other countries as well, actually. Today, we're going to be hearing more about state and federal housing policies, as I mentioned. I understand at this point many folks are possibly suffering from Zoom fatigue periodically. I'm no different, but I'm also extremely pleased today that we can provide you with some voices and perspectives from all over the U.S. as far as the island of Kauai, in the state of Hawaii, to Tennessee, Colorado, and again, right here in our nation's capital. We very much appreciate everyone joining us here to learn more from our NCSL members and partner organizations. We are all hearing and seeing today that there are extraordinary challenges for housing production with inflationary pressures, supply chain disruptions, workforce shortages, all contributing to tumultuous and rising construction costs. Affordable rental housing developments that are currently in the pipeline seem to be facing very complicated barriers throughout our communities, as well as the cost to build and preserve housing and rental properties is making development arguably infeasible. So needless to say, this is timely, but we are very much looking forward to the conversation today. And I think that will be enough from me for now, but let's jump into the program, as it's now my honor to introduce you all to Senator Becky Massey from Tennessee to moderate today's briefing. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. And thank you again for joining us today for this special briefing on housing policy. As John mentioned, I'm Senator Becky Massey from the great state of Tennessee, and I also have the privilege of serving as the co-chair of NCSL's Labor and Economic Development Committee. On our panel today, we are joined by three speakers: the Housing Chair of the Hawaii House of Representatives and Vice Chair of the NCSL Labor and Economic Development Committee, Representative Nadine Nakamura, also Jennifer Swartz from the National Council of State Housing Agencies, or as any good government agency has the acronym NCSHA, and Cameron Rifkin from NCSL. This timely and informative briefing will highlight both state and federal housing policy, along with federal COVID housing spending, the LIFELINE Act, and housing policy collaboration among the states. As is across the country, Tennessee is also experiencing the skyrocketing both rent and housing prices. Because we're such a great state, all kinds of people are moving to Tennessee, and it's really even exacerbating the problem of the housing prices. And so there is the housing shortage, and you have to just basically look at all the tools in the toolbox. And I'm hoping today that we can learn a little bit more about some of those tools. Some of them we're using, some of them I hope to learn about new. So now let's hear from each of our speakers, and then we will open the floor to your questions coming in through the chat box. Our first speaker will be Representative Nakamura from Hawaii. Please go ahead, Representative.
Thank you very much for having me on this webinar. Nadine Nakamura, I represent the island of Kauai, the area, the east and north portions of the island that includes Wailua, Kapa'a, all the way to Hanalei. I've been a housing chair for the last 2 years, and I'm happy today to talk a little bit about housing in Hawaii. Next slide. So everyone sees Hawaii as a paradise. All of these pictures show how beautiful Hawaii is and why so many people want to come and visit. We have 1.4 million people who live in Hawaii, and we have about 10 million visitors a year. Many of them choose to want to live in Hawaii once they visit, and that puts a lot of pressure on the housing market. During the pandemic, people, .comers were buying housing here because our pandemic rates were, COVID rates were so low. They were buying housing sight unseen and making it very difficult for local people to compete. So let's go to the next slide, where is this showing up? Can everyone see the full slide with the costs? Okay, maybe it's just my slide that's not showing it, but where, the gallon of milk on sale was at $6.99. Gas yesterday at Costco was $5.20 a gallon, so I think it's coming down. But the median single family home here is just over $1 million. A median home. The median condominium is about $500,000, and it's very difficult to find rental housing. So next slide, we can see we really have a crisis in Hawaii where we have 4,000 homeless, depending on who you talk to, 4,000 to 6,000 homeless, which is the second highest per capita in the nation. We also have a projection that we need to build 36,000 housing units by 2030. And we have one of the lowest rates of home ownership at 58%, which is the 4th lowest in the nation. Next slide. Like many other places, our unemployment rate is at 4.2%. That makes it very hard to find construction workers to help build these homes. Our construction costs are extremely high at $580 per square feet. And like everywhere else, we have supply chain issues, but we also have shipping cost issues because every piece of material has to be shipped here. And then, of course, our high land cost makes it very difficult. So next slide. So we are, so everyone acknowledges here, the administration, the governor, the legislature, recognize that affordable housing is our #1 problem in the state of Hawaii. This past session, we passed $1 billion, a really unprecedented amount of funding that we anticipate will build over 6,000 housing units over the next, 2 to 5 years. I want to break that down for you. The next slide shows that we included $600 million for housing for Native Hawaiians. This can go toward the creation of house lots, house and lots, potentially rental housing and mortgage assistance. So that's a big component of the funding. Next slide. And then the other key component is putting funding into our rental housing revolving fund. And what made it very different this year for the very first time is we said half of the 300 million, 100 up to 150 million can be used for families between 60 and 100% of area median income. Typically, most of these funds, if not all, go toward families 60% and below area median income because it's used with tax credits. So this was a recognition that we need to be building homes for our working families. Next slide. So a little bit more into the rental housing revolving fund. This is our gap financing for affordable rental housing projects. And it typically ends up being a subsidy of about $160,000 per unit. It's used together with our federal and state low-income housing tax credits. We use a portion of our conveyance tax revenues up to $38 million a year, but the bulk of it is legislative appropriations. And then over the last 10 years, because we have been steadily funding this program, we have built over 9,000 units. Next slide. And another revolving loan fund that we recently created is an affordable homeownership revolving loan fund. This would be for our organizations like Habitat for Humanity that are doing using sweat equity to reduce the cost of housing. And we're really excited that the rules are now in place. So we put the funding in place, and we hope that it will work together with our federal programs that our nonprofits already tapping into. This is just going to be the gap financing. Next slide. We also have our homeless program, which we call Ohana Zone funding. It's $15 million. It can be used for multiple uses. We work with the counties to do transitional housing, emergency shelter housing, assessment centers, and navigation centers. It can also be used for some of the supportive services and wraparound services. So we're excited to continue funding these initiatives. And here's a project on Kauai in Lihue that was built during the pandemic. And we took people off the beaches, people who are homeless. They have a bathroom, a kitchen, a small kitchen, and they are receiving the services they need. So some of them are now into public housing or they're into permanent rental housing. Next slide. And we need more support. The states cannot do this alone. What's happening is that we are not building housing for the people with extremely low incomes who have special needs. So these are people who are coming out of prison, who don't have a place to stay. People who are aging out of foster care are young adults who don't have a place to stay. People with mental illnesses, people suffering substance abuse, our frail elderly, people who with intellectual and developmental disabilities whose parents are getting old themselves and cannot take care of their kids. So this is where our big, my personal interest is in doing more to build supportive housing. And we're going to need everyone's help to make this possible. We'll need project-based Section 8 because people's incomes are so low. And then they need help to pay the monthly rent. And so programs like HUD Section 202, like HUD Section 811 are critical programs to help to make this happen. Next slide. Jessica's going to talk, Jennifer is going to talk more about the LIFELINE Act, so I'm not going to go into that, but we definitely need more private activity bond ceiling. We use this together for our 4% tax credits. So this is a critical need. as long as anything that increases our low-income housing tax credits is welcome. Of course, funding for public housing, the home program, National Housing Trust Fund are all critical funding sources to make our developments happen. And then I just wanted to thank the federal government, thank Congress, next slide please, for all of the pandemic rental relief in Hawaii. We, from the CARES Act, we received $59 million. It helped over 13,000 families. And all of the Emergency Rental Assistance 1, Emergency Rental Assistance 2 are helping people avoid eviction. And that is such a black mark on finding future rental housing. So we mahalo Congress for your help in making this happen. The next slide. And in the American Rescue Act plan, Hawaii received $50 million. We did a pilot on 2 of our islands where 56 homeowners, received funding to catch up on mortgage payments, and we are awaiting the U.S. Treasury approval of our spending plan. So if anyone needs to collaborate, next slide, we have the West Coast state housing groups that meet monthly. It was facilitated by Rep. Julie Fahey out of Oregon, and we had participation from all of the housing chairs in the House and Senate from the states of Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. So if you ever need a one-stop shop to bounce ideas, this is a great forum to get perspectives from our West Coast states. Thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what's happening in the area of housing in Hawaii.
Thank you, Representative Nakamura. Our next speaker is Jennifer Swartz, and she serves as the Director of Tax and Housing Advocacy at the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Senator. I'm going to build on some of the things that Representative Nakamura spoke to and talk about it from a national level. So good afternoon or good morning, everyone. As the Senator said, I'm the Director of Tax and Housing Advocacy for the National Council of State Housing Agencies, which represents the nation's state housing finance agencies, or HFAs. Now, every state has an HFA. They are state chartered, mission-driven agencies that address the full spectrum of affordable housing needs, so everything from homelessness to homeownership. They administer many of the affordable housing programs that are authorized by the federal government, like the low-income housing tax credit, tax-exempt housing bonds, the home program, and the National Housing Trust Fund. I want to thank the National Conference of State Legislatures for inviting me to take part in this briefing today. NCSL is a very important partner for NCSHA. We know that state legislators know that housing is foundational for their state's economies, for economic development, and for the livelihood of their residents. So our nation has long faced a housing crisis, and that crisis is getting worse, unfortunately, not better, especially for low-income renters. We have vastly underbuilt rental housing, especially over the last decade since the Great Recession, when many long-term builders had left the industry. And that problem has escalated even more in the last couple of years because of the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are now facing a situation where supply levels are woefully insufficient, and at the same time, demand for rental housing has gone up significantly. And that imbalance between supply and demand is causing rents to skyrocket. In fact, in most major metro markets, we've seen rents spike by double digits between 2021 and 2022. Now, as many of my members administered the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and that was critical for meeting a time-specific need. But the real solution to our problem, the only thing that is going to have lasting impact, is to build more affordable rental homes, to try and bring supply in line with demand. By far, the most important rental housing production tool we have is the low-income housing tax credit, coupled with tax-exempt private activity multifamily housing bonds. The housing credit is a highly successful public-private partnership. Since it was established in the Tax Reform Act of 1986, it has financed over 3.6 million affordable rental homes for low-income families, seniors, veterans, and those with special needs. In fact, nearly all rental housing built or preserved today relies on housing credit equity. So before we dive into some of the potential solutions to the problem we face, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the housing credit for those who are less familiar. So each year, state HFAs administer a highly competitive process in which developers put forward proposals that the state scores based off of their unique needs as put forward in a extensive public planning process. And winning developers are provided an allocation of credits from the state based off on their proposals. The developers then turn to private investors who provide them with capital upfront that the developer uses as equity to finance the property. And in exchange for that, the investor gets a 10-year stream of tax credits against their federal tax liability. Investors cannot begin to take the credits until the property is built and rented to eligible households. So they are the ones who take on the risk rather than the taxpayer. And properties must remain affordable for a minimum of 30 years. And tenants generally have incomes of less than 60% of area median, with many having incomes below 30% of area median. Housing credit equity typically covers from 30 to 80% of total development costs, depending on the individual project. The financing model is very different than the model for financing market rate housing, which relies far more heavily on debt than it does on equity. But it's the equity that allows the owner to charge affordable rents. So of course, because housing credit equity doesn't cover 100% of the costs, we also need to include some debt in the capital stack. Debt can either be hard debt, and that has strict repayment schedules and market-based interest rates, or it can be soft debt from programs like HOME or the Housing Trust Fund or other funds provided by states and localities that might be more flexible, have below market or 0% interest rates. But the less debt that there is on a property, especially the less hard debt, the more affordable the property can be. Unfortunately, the economic consequences of the pandemic have made it much harder to produce affordable rental housing than at any time in memory. Rapidly increasing development costs are undermining many housing credit projects that are now in the pipeline, and it could have a chilling effect on production and preservation moving forward unless Congress acts. The cost of commodities necessary for construction has gone up substantially, and at the same time, supply chain disruptions are exacerbating the cost increases. According to the National Association of Home Builders, since spring of 2020, prices have gone up for lumber by 75%, steel by 107%, gypsum and drywall by 32%, ready-mix concrete by 11%, interior paint by 33%, exterior paint by 48%, aluminum by 61%, and copper by 57%. In the midst of these increases, we have even less housing credit authority to go around, as a temporary increase in the housing credit resources achieved in 2018 expired at the end of 2021, resulting in a 12.5% cut to the program. These escalating costs have prompted many states and local governments to use funding from the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund for affordable housing, and in particular for gap filler for housing credit finance developments to allow those projects to move forward. According to a recent NCSHA survey, nearly 2/3 of states have pledged to devote approximately $9.5 billion in federal fiscal recovery funds for affordable housing activities. And this includes 24 states that expect to use at least a portion of that money to fill financing gaps in housing credit properties that are currently in their pipeline. What this doesn't include is significant investment that we're expecting of fiscal recovery funds from local governments as well. So $9.5 billion is really a floor. We're expecting more than that could be brought to bear for these projects. But there is a problem. While the Treasury regulations for the Fiscal Recovery Fund program technically allow the use of those funds for affordable housing development, the expectation is basically that those funds would be used as a grant. And grants don't work with the housing credit program. They reduce the amount of housing credit equity a property can qualify for, thus negating the benefit of the grant. So if you have a project where $5 million in housing credit authority equity is going in, and you have a $2 million grant, you've just reduced the amount of housing credit equity to $3 million instead of $5 million. So there's really no point. It's also a taxable event for-profit developers, which is hugely problematic. So what we need to be able to do is use fiscal recovery funds as long-term soft loans to housing credit properties. But under the Treasury guidance, based on certain statutory constraints, there are significant limits to doing this. Essentially, fiscal recovery funds cannot be used to cover the full amount of the loan. The only allowable financing structure is extremely complicated, it's inefficient, and it adds unnecessary transactional costs. But we have a solution. Bipartisan leaders in both the House and Senate are trying to fix the problem so that states could leverage fiscal recovery funds with the housing credit. Senators Patrick Leahy and Susan Collins and Representatives Alma Adams and David Rouser have introduced the LIHTC Financing Enabling Long-Term Investment in Neighborhood Excellence Act, or the LIFELINE Act. It's HR 7078 and S 4181. And this legislation would allow state and local governments to use fiscal recovery funds to make long-term loans with maturities of 30 years or more to housing credit developments. These loans would be soft debt, so the repayments could be recycled to use for other affordable housing activities, including gap financing for future housing credit developments. This approach conforms to typical housing credit development practices and eliminates the reduction in eligible basis and taxable implications of a grant. It also fulfills congressional intent that fiscal recovery fund resources be deployed promptly to support economic activity impacted by the pandemic. So NCSHA and NCSL are among over 100 organizations and businesses from across the country that have endorsed the LIFELINE Act. We strongly encourage all members of Congress to support this legislation. And I'm just really appreciative of NCSL's partnership on this bill. I'd also like to take the opportunity to encourage members of Congress to support the bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which is sponsored by Senators Cantwell and Young, and in the House by Representatives DelBene and Walorski. This is comprehensive legislation that is key to, over the long run, to making meaningful progress towards balancing supply and demand by providing substantial increases in housing credit resources and allowing states to make more efficient use of multifamily bond resources in order to unlock housing credit equity and finance more homes. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act would allow states and their partners to finance over 2 million additional affordable homes across the nation over the next decade. It would also support nearly 3 million jobs, approximately 120 billion in additional tax revenue, and more than 346 billion in wages and business income. In the Senate, there are 35 members from both parties that have already co-sponsored the bill. And in the House, there's 159 members who've co-sponsored, again, with wide bipartisan support. So I am here to answer questions after we finish with all the presentations, but I wanted to thank NCSL again for inviting me and my fellow panelists for having me speak with you today.
Thank you, Jennifer, and for all this useful information. And thank you again for your advocacy efforts on getting the LIFELINE bill passed through Congress. We are hopeful that it will give our states more options and flexibility in building and maintaining more affordable rental housing development. One quick note, during the PowerPoint, we had a little bit of trouble with folks being able to see all the slides, and these will be emailed to everybody that is on this presentation today. But before we go start opening things for our questions, we have one more speaker to hear from. Again, please continue to send any questions you might have into the chat or directly to NCSL staff, to John. We will now hear from Cameron Rifkin. Cameron is a policy associate at the National Conference of State Legislators Children and Families program, where he covers state housing and homelessness issues for NCSL. Go ahead, Cameron.
Thank you, Senator Massey, and thank you all for being here. As the Senator mentioned, my name is Cameron Rifkin. I am a policy associate with the Children and Families Program at NCSL. I appreciate the opportunity to speak at this briefing. I will be discussing affordable housing and more specifically community land trusts, as well as how states are using ARPA funds to address housing needs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So community land trusts, they are also known as housing trust funds. And according to NCSL's research, 47 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico have established and funded community land trusts. These vary by state, but they tend to be membership-based organizations. They have a tripartite board of directors divided into 3 equal groups of representatives. So the first third is made up of leaseholders living on or using community land trust land. Another third is made up of community members. And the final third is made up of technical experts, funders, or other stakeholders. And community land trusts differ from land banks. So land banks are often public, nonprofit, or governmental entities. They specialize in the rehabilitation of vacant, abandoned, and most commonly foreclosed properties. Land banks commonly purchase their property through tax foreclosures. So those differ a little bit from community land trusts. Next slide, please. Here is a map showing you all the 47 states in orange, as well as Guam and Puerto Rico, who have established and funded a state-level community land trust. The states in green, Idaho, Alabama, and Rhode Island, they have established a community land trust, but have not funded it. And then the states, it's a little tough to tell, but the states in blue, Alaska and Mississippi, those states do not have a state-level community land trust, but they have local examples within the state. And then those in gray, Wyoming, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, and the Virgin Islands currently do not have community land trusts. Next slide, please. I'd like to highlight a few recent examples of legislation related to community land trusts. So Florida allows for community land trusts to purchase and complete improvements to provide affordable housing and workforce housing to families. Additionally, Florida is utilizing funds from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, to allocate about $560,000 to the Miami-Dade Homeless Trust Fund to secure additional affordable housing. Colorado is using ARPA funds for affordable housing investments, requiring the Division of Housing to use these funds for programs financed through the Housing Trust Fund or the Housing Development Grant Fund. And as I mentioned, Housing Trust Fund is sometimes a term used somewhat interchangeably with community land trust. It might depend on your state, but those tend to be identical. Again, a little different than land banks, but housing trust funds and community land trusts. And Connecticut similarly is using ARPA funds, about 20 million over the next 2 years, to finance their housing trust fund, housing development grant fund, as well as creating a task force that explores federal funding and how to apply federal funding for state level housing needs. Next slide, please. So we briefly mentioned ARPA, and now we'll take a look at how states are using funds from the American Rescue Plan Act in a variety of ways to address affordable housing needs. So according to NCSL's research, 30 states, the District of Columbia, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico are all using ARPA funds towards housing initiatives. So for example, New Jersey, and I would like to say that priorities tend to include eviction prevention, rental, utility assistance, additional shelter services, and property acquisition or renovations. That's not everything, but those are some of the trends that we've noticed. So for example, New Jersey is using $500 million to create the eviction prevention program and allocate funding directly towards rental assistance. North Carolina is allocating $15 million for rapid rehousing services. This includes deposit and rental assistance particularly for families at risk of homelessness due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Virginia is using $120 million for direct assistance to residents with utility accounts with 60 days in arrear or more. So we see that rental assistance and utility assistance kind of vary by state. Next slide, please. Additionally, Colorado is using $45 million for grants and loans to go towards local governments and nonprofit organizations for the rental, acquisition, or renovation of hotels and motels. They are not the only state to be doing this. We have noticed a few other states as well, sort of transforming hotels and motels into affordable housing, sometimes for immediate homelessness relief and other times for more long-term affordable housing uses. Iowa allocated $100 million for a variety of affordable housing initiatives. These include workforce housing tax credits, funding for the downtown housing grant program, as well as the creation of a minority homebuyer down payment assistance pilot program. So a variety of things coming out of Iowa using the American Rescue Plan Act funds. Pennsylvania, $50 million to accelerate low-income housing tax credit construction projects, which we heard a lot about previously. And these were delayed due to rising construction, material, or labor costs. And so Pennsylvania is using ARPA funds to accelerate some of those. And finally, Wisconsin is using $6 million to provide resources to homeless shelters, domestic abuse safe havens, and youth homelessness or runaway centers, specifically during winter months. Next slide, please. Here is a map showing those 30 states as well as DC, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico. Those are in green, lime green. NCSL maintains several databases, including an ARPA database that tracks how states are using ARPA funding, not just for housing, but for a wide variety of reasons, health, broadband access, education, really a lot of different variety of stuff. Environment. So I would like to let you all know we do have some additional resources we'll be sharing with you all. And so that is a very helpful database that can show you, how states are using their ARPA funds. Next slide, please. As mentioned, here are some additional resources, the housing and homelessness database as well, economic mobility database. We've come out with a few different projects recently. We have a podcast unpacking the affordable housing crisis. We have a Legisbrief opening doors to housing security. We have a state legislator news article dedicated to manufactured homes and housing stability. There's a webinar all about supportive housing and state actions to increase access to supportive housing. And NCSL does have a variety of policy newsletters that we would invite you all to subscribe to. You can get, updates, helpful information on whatever topics you might be interested in, especially housing. Next slide, please. Before closing out, I think John might have mentioned, but if not, we do have the NCSL Legislative Summit, August 1st to the 3rd in Denver. Registration is still open. We would encourage and invite all of you to apply. If you go just to ncsl.org, there should be some information for you there. Obviously, feel free to reach out. Next slide, please. Feel free to reach out with any questions about Summit or this presentation, housing and homelessness needs. If it's a different topic, I'm happy to direct you to someone who might have more information. But again, I really appreciate you all for being here. Thank you, Senator Massey, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Just really appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to any and all follow-up questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, and to all our speakers. And now we're going to go ahead and go with some of the questions. So remember, if you've got any questions, please get them to the chat box. But let's start with a couple here for Representative Nakamura. As you mentioned in your remarks, the cost of housing is basically out of control in Hawaii. I think it is in a lot of places, but that's where you're the expert. So curious what you might consider doing from the state level in the future in the Hawaii legislature in the coming months or year to help further lower the cost and or increase access to housing.
Thank you for the question. I think from the legislators' perspective, we know that there are a lot of very sophisticated nonprofit housing developers, private housing developers, and the counties are all involved in addressing affordable housing. So what we can do at our level is just to provide financing so that these housing developments can move forward. I think what we need to do is just to, we put together $1 billion this year. It's difficult to do that every year, but that's, we need to be putting between 200 and 300 million each year into our different revolving funds. We also need to look at some of the other barriers to housing. One of the things that we're really focusing on is using the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding, and working with our counties and identifying the priority affordable housing developments, and then trying to target our infrastructure funding so that we can move those projects forward. I think that's one of the strategies we will be deploying with this, once in a lifetime opportunity of infrastructure funding.
Great. Are there any other states in particular that you've looked at that had some good ideas that you're, like I always say, copying is the highest form of flattery. And that's one of the great things about NCSL is where we can share ideas among states, and what works in your state might work in mine, but it might not work in, let's say, Ohio or something.
Yeah, and that's, the good thing about our West Coast collaboration of housing agencies is the opportunity to talk about ideas that are working and aren't working. I'm interested in how Washington State, for example, has used recording fees to help finance affordable housing. That's something that we're definitely looking at here. And we know that in California, they've done a lot of work trying to do by right type development. We know there's a lot of pushback when you're saying you're going to build affordable housing. So we're also looking at that and putting together a task force to look at the rules and regulations that prevent affordable housing from getting developed.
Great, great. One thing that I know we did with some of our ARPA funds in Tennessee is Habitat got a grant basically to make grants across the state for actually home repairs instead of building new ones, because a lot of times people can't stay in their homes because they don't have the money to fix them. And it's like 15 million, and it's going to help over 500 homes get up, up to standard, whether it's becoming more energy efficient with their HVACs or whatnot. So, and then in my former career, I ran an intellectual disability agency, and I accessed the Housing Trust Fund. This was before I was elected, and built handicap accessible duplexes for the folks that we served at my agency. So it's all, you look everywhere and everywhere under any stone. But Jennifer, how about you next? I've got a couple of questions for you. The emergency rental assistance and eviction moratoriums, two options that the federal government utilized in response to COVID-19, were essential in getting some people help with maintaining their housing through the pandemic. As the pandemic era renter protections expire and resources are depleted, renters are now encountering a housing market upended by soaring inflation and is arguably impacting renters harder than homeowners. What tools or policies does the federal government need to utilize to keep renters in their homes in both the short and long term here?
Thank you, Senator. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program was such an important program during the pandemic. And I think, the person asking that question is absolutely right, that, unfortunately, it's winding down at a time when rents are skyrocketing, and the people who we've worked so hard to keep them in their homes over the last couple of years are, they're still poor. They're still facing a lot of the same challenges, and now their rents are going up. And so it's not an easy fix. I will say that the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, I think, was hugely successful. It was $46 billion, a little over that, between ERA 1 and ERA 2, which very similar, some differences, but we don't need to go into the nuances there. But states and localities did a ton of work over the last year to stand up those programs, really from nothing. And I think that it really shows how much people care who are working on these kinds of programs, and how nimble they were in trying to address the housing challenges. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of the ERA programs, not because the ERA 1 program technically ends September 30th of this year. ERA 2 was initially expected that it would last through the end of fiscal year 2025, but the money is going to be gone long before that, where I would be surprised if there's much money at all that's left after the end of this calendar year. We're in the process right now of reallocations, and the answer is not an easy one. I know that there are a number of, and I'm sure this is the case with local governments as well, but I just know more about states that have been stepping up and putting either fiscal recovery funds into emergency rental assistance or other state dollars, trying to find some way of meeting the need. Unfortunately, rental assistance itself is a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. And the gushing wound is that we do not have enough supply of affordable housing. And because of that imbalance between supply and demand, we will never have control over this until we build more, essentially. And that also includes preserving existing affordable housing, which sometimes can be much more financially advantageous than even producing new in many areas. So I think the long-term solution is to build. I think that we have the tools that we need to do that. We just need the federal government to invest more in those tools. The housing credit and the bond programs are absolutely essential as tax incentives. And then we have programs like HOME and the National Housing Trust Fund, which are those really critical gap fillers that we absolutely need. So we know what works. We just need to have the political will to do it.
Correct. Well, and I know the Section 8 vouchers are very helpful to folks, but we traditionally are always out and have none available locally.
And you are not the only one.
Yes. Well, usually what happens here happens a lot of places. Well, another question for you, Jennifer, as far as the congressional HUD appropriations process is concerned, can you discuss a little bit about what what's vitally important provisions are for state government, state housing agencies from your perspective?
So the program that I follow most closely and which I think is most critical is the Home Investment Partnership Program, which of course is a block grant to state and local governments that they can use to meet their own unique needs. So those funds are very flexible. They can be used with the housing credit to build more affordable rental housing. They can be used for down payment assistance. They can be used for tenant-based rental assistance. They can be used for existing homeowner rehabilitation. It really is a very flexible program. And that program had over the last decade, it had been cut significantly and has been slowly coming back to where it was from an appropriation standpoint. In 2022, I think it was funded at $1.5 billion, which was the highest level in a decade. But yeah, years and years ago, 20 years ago, which is totally dating myself here, I used to work on the home program, and back then it was close to $1.9 billion. And, so we've gone down over 20 years for that program. And that one is really important. I know there are so many other important HUD programs. Representative Nakamura mentioned many of them, the Section 811 program, the Section 202 program. All of these are critical programs, and we need more funding in them. There's no question. You're on mute, Senator.
When you try to leave it on, then you don't need to. So Cameron, how about for you? Are states that are utilizing federal funds for affordable housing and our rental assistance also adapting legislation to combat these challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. That's a great question. Yes, I guess would be the short answer. States are receiving funds that they've never really seen in this capacity before. And so while we have said that, the emergency rental assistance programs have seemingly been effective for some states, there are other strategies and other federal funds out there that my panelists have mentioned. Yes, I guess would be the short answer, but they're trying to figure out ways that address this affordable housing need that Jennifer alluded to, that is everywhere, rural, urban, big states, small states. It might kind of vary depending on where you are, but we're seeing a lot of the same stuff throughout the United States, and we're seeing states try to figure out innovative ways to address their own respective housing needs. So what might work, in Hawaii might not work in Tennessee, but it doesn't mean that, there shouldn't be that communication and that kind of connection of what is being explored and what is being tried. So I'm not sure if that answered it exactly, but I'm happy to keep talking more and more about housing.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned rural. I mean, oftentimes when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about it more in a more urban setting traditionally. And it is, I think, even a little more challenging in the rural areas just because of the resources that are available and the unique challenges there. But do you think more states might begin looking at the possibility of establishing state housing trust funds? And if so, do you see any states that qualify for the federal matching funds for their housing trust funds that are utilizing those dollar amounts in innovative ways?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. The second part of that, I might need to do a little bit more digging. I'm not sure if I have that immediately in front of me, but I'd be happy to look into that more and provide a more robust, kind of thorough answer. And to answer the first part, yeah, we have definitely seen more trending towards community land trusts. I believe someone in the chat mentioned Minnesota has explored community land trusts. I think it was a part of a larger bill. So sometimes there's, legislation specifically dedicated to creating, these sorts of programs, and other times they're, included in much larger omnibus health and human services bills. I would, like to put that shameless plug that we have the housing and homelessness database that can definitely help folks identify other states that are doing community land trusts. I obviously did not touch on all of them during this presentation, but yes, we are, among other trends in affordable housing legislation, community land trusts do seem to be gaining some momentum at the state level.
And we have one last question, and I'm not sure which one of you wants to answer it, but they were asking to be reminded of the use by date for the ARPA funds for housing. They're familiar with some of the parameters but not the categorical funds. Is there a single place where these timelines are posted? So I guess, Jennifer, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, so I want to first say that a lot of people refer to the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds as ARPA funds, but ARPA itself is a very large piece of legislation with a lot of different programs in it. And so there are different timelines for different programs. Assuming that the person asking the question is asking about fiscal recovery funds themselves, those funds need to be obligated by the end of 2024, calendar year 2024, and they need to be spent by the end of calendar year 2026. That's one of the problems that we've had with the Lifeline, and why we are working on the LIFELINE Act. And that is because loans that are made with fiscal recovery fund dollars either need to be repaid by the end of 2026, which does not work for affordable housing finance, or those loans, if they are made and have maturities after that date, there are these very significant limits on what those funds can pay for, which is why we need that legislation. But those are the deadlines in place.
Perfect, thank you. If we did not get to your questions, NCSL staff will plan to follow up directly with you. I see John, Deanna, and Cameron's emails are posted in the chat. But I just want to say thank you again for everybody tuning in to this housing briefing today. As we've alluded to and talked about, what we're really working toward is attainable housing for all. And, you know, and that's housing across all the spectrums that we've talked about. As we've said, also a quick reminder to all of the NCSL members and staff on the call today. On Wednesday, August 3rd, NCSL will hold another informational session on housing policy at the 2022 Legislative Summit in Denver, Colorado, and it's entitled Opening Doors to Housing Security, to further discuss the trends and challenges that states are combating around housing issues. Thanks again for joining us for this briefing, and have a great rest of your day.